these people over time, right? From the beginning to the end. So tell us a little bit more, Dian. When did you join GOJEK and how many people were you managing before? And right at GOJEK, how many people were you thrown at to manage?
Okay, I joined GOJEK in January 2018. Prior to joining GOJEK, I think the most number of people I've directly managed was like 5 people, right?
5 product managers.
Product managers.
The most.
Yes.
Okay.
Then I joined GOJEK, and I should add the caveat, it takes a village. It's not just me. A lot of folks still roll up to Nadeem and Kevin as well, our co-founders, right? Because we have upwards of 10 product groups, right? When I joined...
So when you joined, it was already 10 products?
Yes. 60 to 70 PMs at the time, and now we are around 120 product managers total.
Total across the company, the groups, and the company that you acquire as well?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So with that, right, I think to set the background, the stage a little bit, GOJEK is a very international team.
Correct.
Right, and then you have teams here in Indonesia, in India, in Singapore, and also a few affiliates company in Thailand, Vietnam, and many more. So how often do you fly now?
I should also add we have an informal set of people in the U.S. actually.
You have people in the U.S.?
Yep. We have a product operations person based out of Berkeley, California, and I also spend half my time in California because my husband, unfortunately, and my cat is still based there, so I have to spend some time.
The cat.
The cat is very important, so I still split my time between Jakarta and the San Francisco Bay Area. So add that to the mix.
Okay, so with that being said, you fly back and forth between Jakarta and the U.S. already.
Yep.
Is that common for people at GOJEK?
It's not super common, but I think it's becoming more common. For example, I think we have a couple other leaders whose families are also still abroad. And so we want to make sure that we are getting talent from everywhere that we need, who meets our needs, right? So we try to figure out together what makes sense for those who need that requirement, right? And we try to be as flexible as possible while keeping our leaders close to the customer and to the market.
So, managing a team in the same location, with scale, growth is already hard enough. So I think for you is adding to that complexity in terms of how do you scale a distributed remote team. Right. So I think that's one of the things that we should be exploring, especially for in here. And I think with that being said, right, so how do you think about, for example, you said you want to find the best talent from all over the world. How do you think about where to place the team as we scale? Do you have a specific place you wanted to place this team in India, place this team in Singapore, this team in Indonesia, and more?
I think, let's see. I would say that organically our different locations have evolved to kind of cater to the different strengths and talents that are available in each region, right? So our engineering teams are heavier in Bangalore and India than in Jakarta, but our product managers are roughly 50-50 between Jakarta and Bangalore. We have more data scientists in Singapore, for example, some in India as well. And our entire research team, of course, is primarily based in Jakarta because that's where our customers are, right? So in terms of that, I think we go where the talent is, and that kind of evolves in that way. I like to think about talent in 2 ways. One, right, we try to build in a very objective way of finding and recruiting and hiring talent, right? Being very specific, especially with product managers, what we need and what skills we're looking for. Otherwise, it's so easy, especially with product management, right? Where it's like, what do you guys do anyway, right? It's sometimes not clear, and there's many different flavors of product managers. So actually requiring all hiring managers to be very specific of like what they're looking for, the skills that they need, because sometimes we will find somebody whose experience isn't necessarily in product management before, but fits the needs, right? And then the other way to look at it is actually to try to grow internally. I think this is a little harder, so kind of trying to keep an eye out for emerging talent within GOJEK, from adjacent functions, right? Like from our BI team, business intelligence, from our data analyst team, from engineering, in fact, and then we've actually developed programs in GOJEK to ensure that there's a really objective way of identifying potential talent and actually having a supporting internal transfer into a product management team that also goes through an internal interview process.
So you have two things, right? You try to scout the talent from all over the world as one, and then identify internal talent for product management. Do you support also international transfer within different countries or?
We actually have had a few people and their families relocate from India to Jakarta. I think as these people are basically the head of product for food, the head of product for merchants group, and a few other people. They realized that they needed to be really close to the market, and they were traveling back and forth so much anyway that it was, a strain on themselves and family anyway. So they just decided to move. So we support that as well.
Okay. So it must be very challenging managing this team, especially to their scale. They're in different company, different offices and stuff. Is there any particular thing you do when you start working with them? And
I think FaceTime is really important, right? Right now I'm traveling back and forth every 1 to 2 months, but when I first joined, I made sure I actually stayed in the Jakarta office for 3 to 4 months without any travel. I basically kind of left my husband behind, which was sad, but necessary.
So why did you do that? Why did you decide to say, hey, I'm going to spend 3 to 4 months in Jakarta at the beginning?
I mapped that to just in general onboarding period of really absorbing all the information you need to get to know a company. Usually I think takes about a quarter, right? And so I just decided that's how long at a minimum I need to be in country and have a lot of FaceTime and make sure I meet everybody that I need to meet so that I can build relationships with them so that when I am away, they know that it's not just this strange name behind a Slack handle, right? They've met me, they know who I am, what I do, what I'm like, and once the trust is earned, I think it's a lot easier to do asynchronous communications and actually trust that somebody will deliver what they're supposed to do even though they're far away.
Yeah, so I think you mentioned a very good point of upfront investment, right? Because a lot of communications, especially as you grow bigger, only about 10% is actually being said or written. Right, just if we were to do a phone call here, it would be a totally different things. So I think the upfront investment that you mentioned is actually a very interesting point because when I say yes, what does a yes mean? When it's in the Slack channel. Right. So with that being said, I think we met up last week and you mentioned one of the things that is quite interesting, silent meeting.
Yes.
Can you tell us a bit more about what it is and where did you get it from? And why do you decide to implement it?
Oh man, you can see me smile because I'm really excited about this. I've been advocating for this across the organization, right? I first learned about it. It's basically a meeting format that became popular at Amazon, right? And
I'm smiling at this because I used to be at Amazon, so I know.
And I've been reading about this for a while, and it actually is a really great format for large groups, for distributed and remote teams, for a few reasons, right? I'm sure you've been in a meeting where basically you have 10, 15, 20 people trying to make a decision, discussing metrics, arguing over what the right next steps are, and usually the loudest voices surface, and then you don't necessarily get to hear from everybody, right?
And I want to emphasize a little bit. Do you see a trend? Because at GOJEK, for example, there is people from different cultures. So some people from different cultures tend to be more outspoken than the other. Do you observe that as well in the company?
And not just cultures, there's different personalities, right? Some people are just more outgoing. Some people have really good ideas, but maybe don't like to jump in and interrupt somebody, right? So this format is really inclusive because basically everybody starts on the same page. You so just to kind of take a few steps back, the silent meeting format requires that whoever is facilitating the meeting does quite a lot of prep in advance to basically lay out the agenda, the desired outcomes of the meeting, prep like a lot of reading material for discussion, right? And so some portion of the meeting, usually about half the meeting, is reserved for just reading that content and leaving the comments in silence directly on the document, right? And then the benefits of that is like I said, it's more inclusive, not just based on personality and people who don't want to kind of jump in and interrupt immediately. It's also better and more inclusive for remote attendees, right? It's like imagine you're like sitting somewhere, in San Francisco in this large meeting where most of the folks are in Jakarta and a few people in Bangalore. They're able to read each other's social cues and kind of know when to interject. You can't really see anybody's faces, right? And you're like, when do I jump in? But if you start off where everybody is on the same page, silently commenting and like plus oneing, then it's a lot easier for you to like insert your voice in there. So number one, that's like super inclusive. Number two, I think it actually saves time, right? Sometimes facilitating meetings like that is a lot harder. You're trying to like actually get people to kind of like line down their comments, and people actually take more care in like what they want to say and write, and like leave really more intentional comments when they have to write it down. So I was able to reduce a monthly meeting that had like 50 attendees by half, like the meeting time, which saves us a lot of time, right? It's a very expensive meeting, so many benefits there.
I think one of the things that you mentioned a few things here, right? In terms of silent meeting, is one key term is preparation.
Yep.
I think a lot of time as we grow, it's only you and me.
Yeah.
You don't have to prepare a lot. You can talk, you can wait. When you're waiting for me, you can go do other stuff, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're at a big scale, if you're not prepared, you're wasting everyone's time, basically.
Correct.
So I think that one is what I like a lot, because the last time I did the silent meeting when I was still in Seattle, I think it takes about 2 months for me to prepare for that one meeting.
Yep.
Doing all the research and stuff. Yeah, so I think
and it kind of forces you to think, do I really need to call this meeting, right?
Yeah.
Or can this be done asynchronously? Sometimes the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And coordinating meeting is the other big problem, right?
Yep.
50-something people in one meeting.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. So as we go through scale, as we grow faster and faster, this is the topic I've been looking into a bit and read into a bit. So I first heard of this term, the rule of 3 and 10.
Yes.
So I heard it from Phil Lisbon, which is the founding CEO of Evernote. And then so it was actually something that he used to think about how to change the structure of the team, right? So when the company is at 3 people, 10 people, 30 people, 100 people, 3,000 people, and 10,000 people, the way you manage people, the structure of the system should be different. So because GOJEK has gone through that 3, 10, and things like that, so is that true? Do you agree with the rule of 3 and 10?
I feel like I can't speak from direct experience, right? Because when I joined GOJEK, it was already, at 70 to 100 PMs. And then beyond the product managers, like we were actually a lot larger. So I actually went and did some research and interviewed some other product managers on my team who've been around since the very beginning, right? So I'm kind of representing some of their experience, and they do, I think, agree in some ways that basically, at each, over the last 4 years that they've been here, Yeti, she was head of product for the food group and is now working with me on the product operations team. She was one of the first product managers at GOJEK, right? So it was like her and a couple other people. And then she inherited basically a bunch more product managers as we acquired other companies and, had like a whole India team join us. And she said there were a few pivotal moments at GOJEK, right? Kind of like the first one was actually leadership kind of taking a look at, okay, what does it mean to be a product manager or a product owner? How do we define this, right? And they attempted to define it and say, we need, product owners to do this for us, for leadership. And I think what she said she learned from that is that we should have been more intentional, right, in like kind of thinking about what does it mean to be a product owner or a product manager, because the label stuck, right? But the expectations on what they were supposed to do weren't very clear. It was just kind of a role that got slapped on to a very young team, and they actually didn't clarify. And in fact, it actually, for some of these young leaders, made it more confusing as to like what they were expected to do, and they kind of felt like they were lacking the support they needed, right? So that's like one lesson, right? And then
So the first one is early on.
Yep.
So you did mention a very interesting thing, because that's the reason why there was a rule of 3 and 10, just to be a little bit more, you use the word intentional.
Yep.
Of like, okay, this is the time we have to do something about it.
Yep.
Okay, so tell us a bit about the second, you mentioned a few pivotal moments, right?
So we were more intentional at the next moment. She identified it as a moment that happened probably like late 2018, right? Where actually
When you were already at
when I was
GOJEK.
already there, so I actually witnessed this, and we were more intentional. We worked as leadership, not just product, so product engineering, the C-suite, other functions worked closely with HR to define some operating principles, right? What does it mean to be a product group? What does it mean to be a functional group, like a business group, like marketing, right? How do they all work together? Because product groups tend to be cross-functional, right? There's like product managers, engineers, designers, marketing. What does it mean to be like a function member embedded in a product group? What does it mean to be just like the core team of a function, like finance or product management?
And to give a bit of a context during that time, how many product managers were there at that time?
I think we were probably around 100.
100 already at that time. And then the size of the whole company?
Gosh, in the thousands, right? If you count all the operational offices across all our regions. Yeah.
Yeah, so you start doing a bit more defining some sort of principle to manage a bit of this company. So I like when you mentioned the word, actually, principle.
Principles,
Yeah,
yes.
because as we scale to hypergrowth, a lot of people start putting in a lot of processes, right? This is what you do, this is our standard SOP and things like that. So how do you define to implement a process versus a principle?
Yep. So, let's see. I have a love-hate relationship with process. I love them when they actually help you be more efficient and help you get the job done quicker. I hate it when it's just there for process sake and you've kind of forgotten what it was there to begin with, and you just forgot to iterate on it, and you're just like, the process is still here even though it doesn't work anymore, right? So I think it's really important to kind of go back to first principles, like, okay, for example, right, let me just give you an example. I think one of the principles I have is I really, like, as we scale, I think it's really important to have clarity in decision making, right? Otherwise you kind of go around and around in circles, maybe try to get consensus, which is, in some areas important, but then at the end of the day, you need clarity in decision making. So if that's the principle, there are different kinds of process where you can achieve that, right? For example, in some cases, I use a framework called like Darcy, right, where every time I kick off a project, I identify one decision maker, one accountable, which could be the same, right, but they're accountable for actually making the decision happen, and if they're not sure, they escalate to the decision maker, and then they have everybody else.
DACI.
Yep.
Yeah, decision maker,
Accountable, responsible, consulted, and informed. So you know who are all these people that need to be in the decision-making process, but you're also clear who's the decision maker. But that doesn't always work, right? Like, so there are other processes, right? Sometimes maybe it's light enough that you don't have to like define like a whole Darcy for a decision, but maybe you want to make sure that we don't go back and forth, so you make sure that your team keeps like a document that logs all the decisions. So if you forget, you can kind of go back, right? Again, clarity in decision making. That's the principle.
Yeah, so I think that's what a lot of people haven't done as much. It's actually locking down decisions that are being made.
Yep.
Because as you go to scale, some of the problems is the same problem happening over and over again. And you start to, repeat over the same thing instead of moving forward. So you mentioned Darcy, which is very interesting thing. So, Netflix, right, published a whole book about culture that got
Yep.
right? So try to do no process or principle, because you trust that the people you hire
Yep.
are good enough to make decision on their own.
Yep.
Do you agree? You disagree? To
Well,
some certain extent.
that's a loaded question. I can bring it back. I think I can tie it back a little bit to process, actually. I had a really interesting conversation with my roommate, who's a really talented engineering manager who's scaled a couple companies before. We're talking about what culture is, right? Like, how do you build a company culture? And we kind of agreed at the end of the day, like, some of it, culture at the end of the day is just building habits across your whole organization, right? Like, the habits, the things that you do every day become normal, right? So like more and more people do it, and that's sort of like what eventually becomes culture. So if you're not intentional about like what habits you're building as a company, then you might have things become culture that you don't want to be like the culture. So again, going back to intention, and then sometimes though habits must be enforced by process, right? So again, like if you want people to keep doing something over and over again with a goal of building a certain kind of culture, then yes, sometimes I think it makes sense to insert some kind of process to ensure that.
Yeah. So process in order to help iterate a few points that you are trying to make. So me personally, I'm very against the word cultural fit
Yep.
to a certain things. To me, I feel like is a BS.
Yep.
In terms of, I don't want to make this decision. You're not cultural. You don't fit the culture here.
Yeah.
Which is saying you're not like me.
Do you have the same? Do you have the same? Do you have the same?
So do you have the same
Feelings about culture
well?
fit? Yes, I think so. I think we have similar feelings about the phrase culture fit, right? It's very subjective, right? It's almost like a very easy excuse to just be like, oh, I don't like this person, so I can just say they're not a culture fit for a company. So at GOJEK, at least for the product management team, and I think starting to like happen across all the different departments is, we unpack that a little bit further to kind of say, when we say culture fit, we mean that we want to evaluate whether or not a candidate is aligned with our company values, right? We have 10 company values, and basically as part of the interview process, we do evaluate that, right? Every single panel is assigned kind of like a value that they need to make sure they evaluate, and we need to make sure that the candidate meets some of that criteria. If they're completely against or like opposite of that value, then that's a red flag, right? That's what we mean by not culture fit, not whether or not we like you, right? And that's more objective.
Yeah, so I think yeah, to the certain extent, because one of the things that I heard you say a few times right throughout this conversation is intention. Be intentional about how you put things in process, how you evaluate people, right? To a certain things.
As a company scale, right?
As a company scale, there are a few things to be intentional about, right? Product management, for example, can grow very, very big. So I want to touch a bit, for engineering, for example, it's more standardized, where you have people who are more specialized, going to be a principal engineer, versus people who are going to be engineering manager, managing the people side. So do you think of that for your product organization? Like to specialists versus, people management track?
We've thought very deeply about this. I think it's important to figure out both tracks, and not even just limited to those two tracks. For product management, I think, my favorite phrase to say is like there's different flavors of product management and product managers. There might be, you might need a very technical product manager, right, for a very technical product, or you might need a product manager with domain expertise in like payments and fraud, for example, or you just might need a generalist one, right, who like is really close to like consumers and understands the customer experience and has some experience there. So the way we've done it is our performance management practice basically evolved to make sure that we take into account all these different skill sets that we look for in a product manager. And the way it happens is that, you can excel at different tracks, right, and maybe not so much in others, but still land at the same level as somebody else who has a completely different skill set than you, right? So for example, you might be looking at 2 level 3 PMs with very different skill sets, and maybe one of them actually manages a large team, and maybe one doesn't, but has a very specialized skill set. So we actually built a framework to support that.
So that is actually very, very interesting, right? Because as the company scale, you tend to have people who come from different backgrounds, and you're trying to standardize
Yep.
the things. First, product management is already very hard to standardize,
Yep.
and then you're putting it across level. So can you share a few tips on the framework that you define? How do you account for those flexibility
Yep.
and still make it fair
Yep.
for people?
So I actually spoke about this at length at the PDC conference earlier this year, but we did build a framework that basically mapped each track to like a certain number of points, right, that you can kind of achieve by growing in a certain track. For example, a track could be like data, right? Maybe you're very skilled in data. Or maybe you're very skilled in a specific business function. Or maybe you're a really great people manager, right? And as you go up the milestones in each track, you actually gain points. And the way we map you to a level is actually a sum of all those points. So it's a very flexible framework where you can win and gain in certain tracks and basically sum up to the same level as somebody else who has very different skill sets. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think you're trying to quantify a few things and,
Yep.
and make sure that points are the same. Does it work well, or
Yes and no.
yes and no?
It's never, something like this is always so nuanced. It's never perfect, right? I think what we learn is that it's very hard to create a perfect system, right, that you want to be objective. And so when the system isn't perfect, what you end up incentivizing is the wrong behaviors. People were kind of like negotiating over their points. And we're like, no, this is about your growth, not about your points, right? But we're humans, you know, we see numbers, we're like, we want to maximize and optimize that. So one of the things that we are going to try doing is actually giving the managers and the leaders a bit more discretion in saying, okay, like this points and these, you know, the sum of these points is one data point for you to decide what level this person is at, right? And then there's actually more holistic guidelines for it.
Yeah. So those are planning for flexibility,
Yeah.
I would assume. So we talk a lot during this session about managing the team, putting process for the team,
Yeah.
and things like that. But I think as a leader, we almost sometimes forget to look inward.
Yes.
As a company scale throughout the time, how do you yourself? How do you scale yourself through this hyper growth? Because the learnings are new every single day. What do you do to keep up with all this new people,
Yeah.
process, knowledge? Yeah.
I think it takes a lot of humility to scale oneself. I think
Because you mentioned, right, one time you were at managing 5 people before,
yeah.
Suddenly like
60.
Yep.
people now 100.
Exactly.
Plus people.
Yeah. I think there are 2 principles I try to live by. One is to always try to hire people who are like smarter and more experienced than you, right? I think that takes a bit of humility. Be like, hey, there's lots of people who like know this better than I do, and so I always try to do that. A really good example of this actually happening recently is Crystal, who is our head of BI. Did this exactly by actually driving the process to hire a chief data officer, because you know that's what we think it's going to take us to the next level, and we don't have experience for that. So let's find somebody who does, right? So it takes humility, and I think the second piece is just always thinking about how to make myself redundant, right? It's like, that feels like so sad. I'm not needed anymore. But like, if you find ways to do that, that's how you also make time for yourself to grow and find the gaps, right?
So the 2 principles you're basically saying is actually one, which is what I agree with as well, because this is what I learned from Amazon, is they have raised the bar
Yep.
principle where you know people you hire should be better than who you are, everyone, right? So that's how the company scale. And yeah, and I think second piece is I tell the team all the time, I want to work so that I can fire myself,
Yep.
right? So
Yep.
it's challenging to go through that process.
Yep.
I think we went through it.
Yeah, definitely. I think there was a Q&A recently. They asked me like, hey, you just established a product management operations team. How do you know when you've like actually achieved your objective? I'm like, well, I'll know when you actually don't need us anymore because like all the practices have been embedded enough that you don't need us as a team, right? So.
Yeah, so I think through all this, you have shared a lot of learning throughout your own experience, moving from the US to back to Indonesia, and managing now a very cross-functional team. So I think of a few things if I were to summarize for the audience. One thing you mentioned a lot of time is actually be intentional
Yes.
about every single thing you do. Placing the team, improving yourself, managing processes, managing meetings.
Yep.
So with that, thank you so much for sharing
Thank
this
you.
information with us, Dian. And thank you to the
you.
audience.
Oh.